Welcome back to Matthetai. We're here continuing on in our apologetic studies of the existence of God. We've looked at a brief introduction to arguments for the existence of God and laid out four that we're going to explore a little bit more in depth, give you a good understanding of each of those four. And then last time we looked at the ontological argument for the existence of God. Today, we want to take a step further and look at the teleological argument. Now, the teleological argument is also known as the design argument or the information design argument. And it looks at the universe as a designed, organized, complicated, complex entity and concludes that therefore there must be some intellectual designer that has put that complexity into the universe. We'll look at that a little bit more in depth today and explore that a bit more. Now, first of all, we want to say that these teleological arguments, that the name derives from the Greek word telos, and telos simply means end or purpose. And when there is design, there's usually a purpose that design was intended for. It was meant to arrive at some goal or some end, some utilization. And so when we look at the universe and we see design in the universe, we would conclude, therefore, that there is some design or some purpose or end that this universe has been organized for. And we'll look at some of the limitations of this argument as well, because there certainly are some of those. Now, the appearance of design, the apparent appearance of design, indicates a designer. Early arguments here date way back to the Greeks, including Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. These were developed even further and really favored by the Stoic philosophers. So if you're a fan of Greek philosophy, those would be some places you could look to find some early versions of this. It persisted throughout the ages, including Thomas Aquinas, Anselm, who we saw last week with our ontological argument, and then William Paley was an individual in the last couple hundred years who really revived this argument and made it much more prominent. Now, as we look at this argument, we want to start with Aquinas. Now, Aquinas looked at this from the concept of dispositions or ends, that there's a certain goal to which a thing strives. And when we look at the universe, there seems to be a goal that this universe is striving towards or is reaching towards. An example that's given by Aquinas is that acorns. When we plant an acorn, it develops into an oak tree. Never will we plant an acorn and grow something different. We'll never grow an animal or a different kind of a tree. The inherent in the acorn is the design to produce a specific function, a specific goal, a specific end. And if it fails to achieve that maturity, it still has that inherent in the design of the acorn itself to reach that goal. So if we look at this universe, we can say that this universe has inherent in its design the ability to reach a certain goal of maturity. And if it has that design inherently, then therefore there must be a designer behind that established that disposition or that end. And so Aquinas tried to use this argument to speak about an intelligent being as the best explanation for these goals. How do we explain these goals or these ends or dispositions being in that system, in that item? And it can only be done by an intelligent being. And so it's either there because an intelligent being has put it there, or it is inherently intelligent itself. And we know that these objects, the universe itself, is not inherently intelligent. The universe itself is impersonal. The universe doesn't have those types of qualities, even though we often speak about Mother Nature or things in the universe having these humanistic qualities. They certainly don't possess these attributes. The universe is an impersonal entity with none of these personal traits that we would ascribe to personhood, such as intelligence. Now, William Paley took this argument and he brought it a little bit further. Anselm made this argument in his proslogion before moving on to the ontological argument in his monologion, as we saw last time. And William Paley presented a form of this argument using the analogy of a watchmaker. And he imagined that if you were walking through a forest and you happen upon a pocket watch lying on the ground, You could pick it up and you could examine the pocket watch, take it apart and see the mechanism, see it operating. And even if you've never seen a pocket watch before and you don't understand what it's for, you would note that the way that it was constructed and the operation and movements of all of those components would indicate that it was designed for some function or some purpose. And therefore you would conclude that that pocket watch is not a natural, accidental occurrence, but that it was purposely designed to do something. And it was created by somebody, it was organized and arranged by some intelligent force that produced it in that manner. And he would argue that since the universe has apparent design in it, there's functions and there's systems and all these things working together in complex mechanisms that work, that therefore we ought to conclude that it was designed and organized and arranged by an intelligent being outside of the universe itself. And so he called this the blind watchmaker argument. And so these objects don't have an inherent design to them. We wouldn't expect nature to, through wind and water erosion and natural forces, to produce a pocket watch out the other side, just as we would not expect nature through natural forces to produce a more complex and intelligently designed organism for functioning. And so he was arguing that therefore you must have some intelligent outside agency acting upon those forces, acting upon those components to produce the final product. Now, a brief formation of this argument could look like this. It says, premise 1, human artifacts are products of intelligent design. They have a purpose. Premise 2, the universe resembles these human artifacts. And therefore our first conclusion would be, therefore, it is probable that the universe is a product of intelligent design and has a purpose. And he adds a third premise. Premise 3 is that, however, the universe is vastly more complex than a human artifact is. And so our second and final conclusion would be that therefore there is probably a powerful and vastly intelligent designer who created the universe. So now let's look at each of those premises real quick. In premise 1, human artifacts are products of intelligent design. They have a purpose. And so when we come across an artifact, when you come across something in nature, archaeologists do this all the time, and we see something that demonstrates order and design and function, we automatically attribute that to a civilization or an intelligent being at that time. We don't find a tool in the ground and think that nature itself created this tool through the forces of nature. We don't find stones stacked on top of each other in a wall-type formation and think that that's a natural formation. We would always conclude that this was a constructed object that was put there by intelligent beings. And so therefore, human artifacts and these human products seem to have the indication that there was somebody behind it. There was a human intelligence behind that design, and they designed it for a purpose. We built the wall to have a house. We built the tool because we needed to do a work, and so on and so forth. And he says in premise 2 that the universe resembles these human artifacts. The universe itself has indications of organization and structure, and therefore we can compare the universe to these human artifacts, although they're vastly different in size and expanse and so on, and even complexity. And so that would be the biggest argument against Paley's argument here, is that to compare the universe to human artifacts is a big stretch. It's a big jump. But we can see some of the similar traits. We see indications of design, indications of external forces acting upon these elements and these things to create an organized structure that seems to fulfill a specific purpose. And that was his argument there. And since the universe is such much more complex and vast than a simple human artifact, we must conclude that the one that has designed this universe and constructed it and created it in such a way must be vastly more intelligent and more powerful than a human. And so that's where he takes this argument there. Now, we need to make one distinguishment here, and this would be a limitation of this argument. The teleological argument talks about a designer rather than a creator. When we look at the things of man, the human artifacts, these are things that have been designed by man. We took pre-existing materials and rearranged them and formed them in such a way to create the more complex object. We didn't create those materials in the first place. So when we speak about a creator, we're speaking about a being who is the cause of all things, the one who has originated all being and all matter. And so the teleological argument is limited in that sense that it cannot tell us about the creator. It can simply tell us about the designer who arranged all of these artifacts. And so we can't make that jump back to a creator, but it certainly speaks of an intelligent God that is consistent with Scripture. What we might say is that you see the fingerprints of God all over creation. And these fingerprints don't necessarily tell us who put them there, but it gives us indications and identity of the individual that designed it and organized it all together. And then the other arguments that we're looking at give more of an indication of who actually began and originated the material itself. And so in line with our ontological argument, our cosmological argument, which we'll get to next time, and our moral argument, which is coming up soon, we could see that those arguments better show that there is a creator out there, and that creator has designed this universe in this way. Now, in Psalm 19:1, let's get a couple of scriptural understandings of these arguments. It says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. And then that entire chapter in Psalms 19 goes on to talk about the design and the handiwork of God as seen throughout creation. And so it seems to be indicating that there is a design and a function and a purpose to this universe that is put there by God, that God has created this universe in such a way and his fingerprints are on it. And similarly, in Romans chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, verses I think many of us are familiar with, Paul is talking about how we are responsible to God. And he says in verse 19 of Romans chapter 1, he says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse." So God has put his attributes into his creation. We're able to see indicators of who he is because of the things that he's made. He's expressed himself through creation, to some extent at least. Romans 1 tells us that it's his power, eternal power and divine nature is demonstrated through creation. And so if this is kind of what this design argument is pulling out, that God can be seen as the designer through what he has designed, and we can learn a little bit about God that way. Now, in our modern day here, because of the advances in science and our understanding of the universe, we can see God as a designer in a much more detailed way. And what we see is we see a universe that appears to be very fine-tuned for life and the life that we know. And so there's a number of things we want to look at real quickly about the fine-tuning of this universe. This universe exists in such a way that it's very exact in so many different details that if anything were different, life could not exist. So the purpose of this universe appears to be to sustain life, to allow life to exist. And so let me give you a couple of examples scientifically of where this design argument would come into. First of all, we have the right molecules that are present. We have to have these certain molecules there. There's 40 different elements needed that would bond together to form molecules, and these molecules are necessary molecules for life. And so these bonds, if you're familiar with chemistry, exist as electrons on these molecules are either shared or given up, and these molecules are stuck together by electromagnetic forces and by the mass of the electron. And so we got some very specific information here. If the electromagnetic force, think of holding two magnets together with a positive end and negative end, and they're going to attract each other together. And here we have a negatively charged electron being attracted to a positively charged proton in the nucleus of another atom. And that electromagnetic force is going to draw those two together. If that electromagnetic force was any greater, any stronger, then the proton would suck the electron away, and it would draw that electron, and it would not allow that electron to be removed into another atom, and you would not have any sort of bonding. If that electromagnetic force was any weaker, then that proton would not be able to hold on to that electron, and it would slip away, and you would not have any electrons on your atom as well. And so that electromagnetic force has to be just right. It has to be just strong enough, yet just weak enough to allow the sharing of electrons. And then also you've got the size of that electron compared to the size of the proton, the masses of each, if you will. If they're slightly off, if the mass of the proton is any bigger, it's going to overwhelm the mass of the electron and draw it in and overwhelm it. And again, if the electron were any bigger, it would escape the proton much easier. So the sizing relative to each other must be exactly right. And then you've got the strong and weak nuclear forces. These are the things that hold the nucleus of the atom together, the protons and neutrons. If these nuclear forces are any greater or any weaker, you're going to hold those protons and neutrons together, and you're going to attract all of the other protons and neutrons. And so we'll have a massive, heavy nucleus. We wouldn't be able to have a single proton, which we would be required to have in hydrogen, which is one of the foundational essential molecules or elements of life. And if we didn't have hydrogen, because we're forming only heavy elements with heavier nuclei, we wouldn't be able to have life. And so if those nuclear forces are either too strong or too weak, those nucleuses could not exist in the way that they do. Or the nuclei, the plural of nucleus is nuclei, not nucleuses. Thanks for catching me on that one. And then we can get into some other details about the various atoms that are in the universe. We've got to have the right types of protons and neutrons, the sizes and relationship of them. We have to have the right number of electrons. The relationship between the number of electrons and the number of neutrons has to be right so that there's enough to form the elements that are necessary in order for bonding and the different types of molecules to exist. And so we would have to overcome all sorts of forces to do that. And when we get beyond that, we look at the universe itself. The universe itself has all sorts of settings that seem to be fine-tuned to allow for life. I'll give you just a couple of here, that if these are off by even a small fraction, then the universe would not exist as we know it. The speed of light, which is 299,792,458 meters per second. And if that's off just a little bit, then the universe would not exist. Our gravitational constant, 6.673 times 10 to the minus 11th meters cubed per kilogram per second. Planck's constant, Planck's mass energy, the mass of the electron, proton, and neutron, which we mentioned. We've got the mass of quarks, the ratio of electrons to protons. We've got the cosmological constant, Hubble's constant, Higgs vacuum expansion or expectation values. You can look any of these up online and you can see that they're very fine-tuned exact numbers. That if any of those are off and the way they interrelate and the way they exist in nature, we would not exist. Life would not be able to exist without this exact fine-tuning. And then finally, we can look at our Earth. Our Earth itself has some very fine-tuned properties to it. If we simply took the distance of the Earth to the sun, if we were any farther away, we would be too cold. Any closer, we would be too hot. And so we're the exact distance away from the sun. That's why when astronomers are looking for other Earth-like planets, they're looking for those that are the right distance from their star to have the right heat element and heat signatures. And then our moon is the exact distance from the Earth that it needs to be. The gravitational pull is just right. And the tides and movement of our ocean are dependent on the moon's positioning in relationship to the Earth. And you also look at the air around us. The percentages of each element in the air itself is just right. If we increase these too much, this is why issues of global warming and climate change and the ozone layer and these sort of things are such an issue, because if they change the nature of our atmosphere, it can destroy life on Earth. And so we're at such a fine-tuned level of all of these different elements. And then you can look at multiple different facets of natural geology and chemistry and the human being itself and so on and so forth, that all of these are very fine-tuned and have very specific characteristics that if they did not exist, then we would not have life here on Earth. And so this design argument is telling us that there's such a fine-tuned universe that we exist in that seems to be designed for the purpose, the goal, the aim of sustaining life and specifically life here on earth. And so from that argument, we could backtrack and say, if this is designed in such a way and has such a purpose, how did that purpose get there? And that purpose, as far as we can understand, and logically speaking, can only come from an intelligent source that designed, that organized and arranged everything in such a way to meet that goal. And that's the argument for the teleological argument here, that this universe is designed in such a way to allow you and I to have life. And therefore, there must be a designer or an architect of the universe that has put all of this design in place. So I hope that helps you. I hope that gives you more of an understanding that scientifically we can look at the facts there, the measurements that are there, and say, yes, those are not an accident. These are not possible by blind chance. The odds of this universe existing the way it does by blind chance are virtually zero. And so the designer being postulated there, that there is a designer and architect to this universe, is a very rational argument. So with the ontological argument and the teleological argument, we can see that there is a necessary being, and this necessary being has designed this universe in such a way to allow life to exist. We'll look next time at the cosmological argument and then the moral argument, getting back to that creator and what we can find out about the creator, and then our life here and our principles and where they come from. So join us next time on Mathatai. We're glad you're here. Check out our website at mathatai.org. We're going to be putting up some blogs, some additional materials there, and check out what we're doing around the globe as we get to go and visit many of these countries and teach pastors and leaders the gospel and share with them. But we'll see you next time.